Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Allah Almighty says in chapter 2 verse 20 that أَوْ كَصَيِّبٍ مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ فِيهِ ظُلُمَاتٌ وَرَعْدٌ وَبَرْقٌ يَجْعَلُونَ أَصَابِعَهُمْ فِي آذَانِهِم مِّنَ الصَّوَاعِقِ حَذَرَ الْمَوْتِ وَاللَّهُ مُحِيطٌ بِالْكَافِرِينَ. Describing the trials that come upon the believers and the way in which the disbelievers react to them, Allah Almighty says that, or it is like heavy rain from the clouds, wherein is thick darkness and thunder and lightning. They put their fingers into their ears because of the thunderclaps, for fear of death. And Allah the Almighty encompasses the disbelievers. Now in commentary of this verse, Hazrat Muslim Maud who explained that this verse describes as it with an analogy that the coming of blessings from Allah Almighty is preceded by trials. And one who fears those trials is like a farmer who sees rain coming and does not work to gather water but instead hides in his house. This analogy that Hazur is given can make it clear to us the way in which our perception should be when it comes to spiritual rain descending from the skies. Now, darkness on the horizon, lightning and thunder, they are on the surface frightful things. But for somebody whose work it is as a farmer to profit off of these things, and whose livelihood depends on the proper usage of the resources that Allah Ta'ala has provided, when they see these frightful things on the horizon, they don't despair, they don't get scared, but they get excited. They're happy because they know that this is a sign that rain is coming, and this is what is going to be a source of fruitful season. So this is also the case of a believer, that when a prophet of God comes, Hazur explains that the coming of a prophet also on the surface seems to bring disorder. It brings those clouds and those lightning and that apparent darkness with it because of the opposition from the world. But in fact, that is a sign of the coming of rain, of the water that is to descend from the sky. And so a believer also, when he sees these signs on the horizon, he doesn't get afraid, but he becomes excited because he knows that now something is stirring and now something great is about to happen. And the way he responds is with preparation. Now, Huzur gave the analogy of the farmer and said that imagine if there was a farmer who, when he sees clouds on the horizon, he gets scared and then he hides in his basement. That farmer would never be able to survive. What a good farmer does is that he becomes busy and occupying himself on how to capitalize on this rain that is coming, how to allocate those resources best, how to preserve what is happening. And this is the same thing with the believer. It is only the hypocrites who get scared when they see trials coming and then they run from them, and then they don't make proper preparations. But a believer, when he sees trials coming, he makes more preparations. He sees opportunities on the horizon and he becomes more involved in his work to try and make sure that he doesn't lose out on any of those opportunities. So this is the distinction between a true believer and between a person who is suffering from the ill of hypocrisy which is being described in these verses. So long as we were not farmers, we could hide from the thunder. But once we have decided to be spiritual farmers for the sake of Allah Almighty, then it is no longer our luxury, nor does it make any sense for us to hide and to fear that thunder and that lightning. So the moment a person enters the true community of Allah Ta'ala, then it comes with these prerequisites. It does not make any sense for a person to choose the profession of being a farmer when he has a phobia of rain and of thunder and of lightning. So once a person has chosen to become a Muslim, then trials accompany it. And to face and to brave those trials and to pull the blessings of Allah Ta'ala in as a result of that is part of the process. So this is also the responsibility of an Ahmadi. Once a person has chosen to be a farmer in the kingdom of Allah Ta'ala, then there is no room for that person to have any fear of the lightning and the thunder and the trials that come. And it is only those who are hypocrites, who are contradicting themselves in every step of their behavior, who choose to be a believer on the surface and then do behavior that is completely the opposite. Now, describing another aspect of the behavior of those who are hypocrites, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Awwal Radiyallahu Anhu describes in context of this verse that it is foolishness for a person to put their fingers into their ears on seeing lightning and at the sound of thunder. And this is what is described in this verse, that when that thick darkness and thunder and lightning comes and they put their fingers in their ears because of the thunderclaps, that thunder is something that makes them put their fingers into their ears. But Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Awwal Radiyallahu Anhu describes that from this analogy we see that thunder is something that is only a sound of the lightning that has already happened. Whatever damage was going to be done has already been done. The lightning is actually what is dangerous. That's what actually destroys things and destroys property and takes lives. And that's something that has light in it. It is the fastest thing. The thunder is something that comes to us seconds later and sometimes many seconds later. So for a person to fear the thunder, he is not fearing anything in reality. He is just fearing something that is frightful. And so the act in and of itself is foolish when we look into it, when a person reflects on it for more than a moment. So this is also the case of those who are hypocrites. It shows a short-sightedness on their part, a separation from the reality of the situation that they are in, the reality of their surroundings. The harm is something that is already past, and they are fearful of only the most surface things because they are thinking out of their fear and of their emotions, and not out of sincerity with Allah Ta'ala. They are not grounded in reality. So this is a pattern that is seen in the behavior of those who are hypocrites. It is that shallowness of perception and that lack of insight and that lack of depth of understanding of spiritual realities that causes them to behave in these ways. Now, when we look into this analogy and see the situation of hypocrites that have come throughout history, then we can see how perfectly it applies. In the early community of Muslims, there were people who accepted Islam just out of social pressure, and they thought that they could, on one side, hold on to Islam and be able to keep good relations with their friends and their family, and on the other hand, they could keep good relations with the disbelievers and show that they were double-sided and show that they were on their side. But ultimately, it didn't help them at all. They were trying to save themselves from the thunder, but the lightning ended up hitting them anyways. The same thing is what we see that happened with the Lahori Jamaat within the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, which is that during Khilafat-e-Ula, they sought to adjust and change those doctrines of Islam and Ahmadiyyat, and particularly those teachings of Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam and those correct interpretations of those teachings which brought about the anger and the persecution of non-Ahmadi Muslims. Points on the doctrine of kufr, points on the doctrine of reading prayers behind non-Ahmadi Muslims, and these different controversial subjects that invited and was used as a source of inflammation against Ahmadis by those who were non-Ahmadi Muslims to turn people against the Jamaat, to become a source of persecution. It was out of a fear of that persecution that they sought to alleviate it. They sought to make compromises. They sought to make changes in our doctrines and in our approach. And this was essentially putting one's fingers into their ears out of a fear of the thunder when the lightning is already there. And so what we've seen throughout history is that the Lahori Jamaat has not been able to save themselves from any of the persecution that they hoped for. Within Pakistan, even right now, they come under all of those laws and all of those oppressive rules that apply to the Ahmadiyya Jamaat that is under Khilafat. So those attempts to try and save themselves from the trials of persecution were irrelevant, and they did not do them any good. And in fact, ultimately, they did harm to themselves. So the overall message of this verse is that trials are things that are to be overcome. They are not things to be avoided. And it is important to have an understanding of the philosophy of suffering in the first place. Now, many people have a misunderstanding and they think that suffering is bad, and therefore it should be avoided. And so then any suffering that comes in an unjust way from Allah Ta'ala, in their perception, is somehow something objectionable against Allah Ta'ala. But this concept of suffering is wrong. Suffering is not to be avoided, it is to be overcome. If our purpose as human beings was to avoid suffering, we would have never made it to the point that we are at right now in our evolution. If the purpose of suffering was to be avoided, we would never go to school. After all, why does a person go to something as difficult as medical school? To put themselves through years and years of difficulty and torture and suffering. It is because the person knows that there is a greater benefit in overcoming suffering. If our objective was to avoid suffering, we would sit comfortably in our homes and not put ourselves to any hardships. But the whole purpose of life and every step of progress in life is made when we put ourselves into hardship and suffering for the sake of a greater good and with the objective of overcoming it. So to overcome suffering is our purpose, not to avoid it. And this applies in the spiritual realm as well. Now, those people who take on this backwards approach, as is seen by the hypocrites, that principle is something that leads one to failure both in the worldly realm and also in the spiritual realm. So when in the physical realm we are open to taking on suffering and facing and braving different difficulties to overcome them and achieve greatness, so also in the spiritual realm, to achieve those high levels of spirituality, this is also what is required of us. So this principle of understanding the purpose of suffering and also of seeking the rewards of Allah Ta'ala through every hardship is a characteristic of a true believer. And this is a point that we have been reminded of in this verse of the Holy Quran through the analogy that Allah Ta'ala has given us of the blessings of rain that come through the difficulties of darkness and thunder and lightning, and how there is a difference between the way that believers and disbelievers react to it. So now with that, we'll end the dars, and if there's anyone who has any questions, then we can briefly address them.
At another place it is mentioned, وَلَا نَبْلُونَكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنْفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ راجعون. Hazrat Islam has explained in Kashti Nuh, लाजम है कि हमारे रंजो मुसीबत से तुम्हारा इम्तिहान भी हो जैसा कि पहले मोमिनों के हो. ऐसा ना हो कि तुम ठोकर खाओ. खबरदार हो कि ज़मीन तुम्हारा कुछ नहीं बिगाड़ सकती अगर तुम्हारा आसमान से पुख्ता तलक है. तुम जब कभी अपना नुकसान करोगे तो अपने हाथों से ना कि दुश्मन के हाथों से. अगर तुम्हारी ज़मीनी इज्जत सारी जाती रहे तो तुम परेशान मत हो क्योंकि आसमान पर खुदा तो तुम्हें लाजवाब इज्जत देगा. दिस आल्सो रिलेट टू दैट मैटर दैट you will be tried, it is must, lazam hai. It is compulsory that you will be tried, and after that you will be given high status in the spiritual life or the life of which is given to the true believers.
Jazakallah.
The question that I have is, for everyone's edification, is how can one tell if what one is going through is a trial or from God, or is it a punishment from God?
So everything is a trial. Even a punishment from Allah Ta'ala is a trial. And even a punishment can be a source of blessings. In fact, the punishment of the hereafter, of course, has a different nature. Even that is a means of reformation, but that at that point the time of repentance is gone and over. But any punishment that comes in this world is in fact a blessing, if anything. I don't remember, maybe I had mentioned this here, maybe somewhere else. But it is a sign of favor of Allah Ta'ala that He would actually go out of His way to punish us in this world. And this is something that we'll go over in another daris, but there is a concept of Allah Ta'ala being, different people who are theistic give their opinions on what the nature of Allah Ta'ala is. Does He interfere in this world? Some people, many scientists and philosophers who believed in God said that Allah Ta'ala just created the world and then just left it as it is. Islam gives a middle path between the two. And it teaches that there is a taqdeer-e-am which is in force, and it continues in its laws. And Allah Ta'ala then interferes through taqdeer-e-khas, which is called miracles. So if a person is punished by Allah Ta'ala in this world, then that essentially is a miracle. It's not under taqdeer-e-am, it's not under the laws of nature. It is something that Allah Ta'ala has miraculously chosen to choose that person for. Now, there are some punishments that come upon the disbelievers that come to destroy them. But a punishment that comes upon the believers is not to destroy them, but to reform them. So it is the same as when a person's parents punishes them to bring them on the right path. It is an expression of love. In fact, the worst thing that can happen to a child is when their parents get so angry at them that they refuse to talk to them. It's far better to get punished by your parents than to be in that state where our parents are so angry that they say, go do whatever you want, don't talk to me, I'm not going to say anything to you. So if a person finds themselves through whatever knowledge that Allah Ta'ala has given them that they are actually being punished in this world by some trial that has come upon them. And this is not something a person should speculate on. We should consider everything a trial. Only that is a punishment which we know through certainty from communication with Allah Ta'ala that it is a punishment. Because if we start speculating, it leads to many other negative things and paranoias. But if a person knows that they are being punished with a trial from Allah Ta'ala, then it is a point of gratitude that Allah Ta'ala loves that person enough that He seeks to correct that individual in this world, rather than to just leave him to his state and then take the full account of that person in the hereafter. Okay. Jazakallah.